Turn-taking is a special topic. This is about coordination of people who are engaged in a conversation. So when people speak to each other, turn-taking is the topic about finding out and determining who has the floor, who is the person who actually speaks. Of course, in a conversation of two people or more in a group, everybody is active, even the listeners. They constantly or repetitively signal back information. This is called back-channeling or feedback. And this is about giving signals that they are still listening, they're still following. Something like, go on, or here I am, you still have my attention. This can be verbal, like, aha, okay, or some small comments, but they usually are non-verbal, this kind of back-channeling, like, or even some facial expressions or head movements and so on. The important thing is that these back-channeling does not disturb and interrupt the speaker who has the floor. It signals that they are attentive, and it can even affect the talker a little bit. That means if I have some emotional response to what the speaker says, or if I'm a little bit in doubt if this is really true, I can signal this to the speaker, and he or she will, for example, follow this and elaborate a little bit more or react on my back-channeling. But overall, the speaker still has the floor and is speaking. So turn-taking is about the change of who is speaking, who has the floor. And this is signaled and coordinated at so-called transition-relevant points. So for example, if I'm speaking here and I'm finishing my utterance or my point that I want to make, everybody who is engaged in the conversation can foresee this, can predict this. And in the transition-relevant point, when I'm going down in my voice a little bit, low pitch, I'm going to be a little bit slower. And at this point, there are actually three options. One option is that I determine the next person to have the floor. For example, by actually explicitly stating this, like, Frederick, what do you think about that? But of course, there are other options. Maybe I do not want to give away the floor. Maybe I want to continue, although I have done my point and finished it. I will then signal that I still want to continue and want to hold the floor. I do this, for example, by not going slower or down in pitch. I may even inhale visibly and audible so that the listeners, my dialogue partners, know that I want to continue. The third option is that I'm giving the floor away. I'm giving the floor free for everybody to grab it. Typically, the active listeners would have already announced by some nonverbal signals that they are interested in taking the floor. But if nobody does it, I can even take the floor again myself. So how does this look like? These signals that indicate that I am giving away the floor, I have already done some examples in voice, they are nonverbal and multimodal. And that means I can also decrease a little bit in my gesturing. I start looking at the other people, gazing at them. These are all signals that now there's a transition relevant point and I'm giving away the floor. So, what do listeners do? If they want to attract the attention and want to indicate that they want to have the floor, they also show this by signaling. For example, by leaning forward or making themselves tall, or by audibly inhaling or starting to gesture a little bit. So with gaze, we have, for example, two patterns that are well known: the mutual break and the mutual hold. The mutual break is the more typical one, or the smoother one. That means if I have the floor and at a transition relevant point I end my turn, then I lock gaze with the listener who wants to have the floor, and then he or she breaks the gaze again and starts talking. This is a rather smooth pattern. Another one, the mutual hold, is a little bit different. In this case, the listener does not break the gaze pattern, but still has locked eyes and starts talking. From a little study, there was shown that this is indicating a more non-smooth overlap or non-smooth turn-taking. The interesting thing about turn-taking is not only that it's multimodal, but also that it is really smooth. And this means typically we predict when it's going to happen. And therefore, it means that the actual breaks or pauses that we have during turn-taking are rather small. Sometimes there's just a small part of overlap, which is not disturbing anybody from talking. Or there's even a rather small break or pause of silence. If there's too much silence, then everybody would consider this as a little bit awkward and non-smooth. So turn-taking is this interaction control, which is predicted and prepared by everybody who's actively engaged in the conversation and is signaled in a multimodal way. And as you can imagine, in current human-computer interfaces, this is not the case. Typical speech-related systems, they do not predict when the user will have finished his or her utterance. Typically, we have a kind of push-to-talk system, which means that I, as a user, push a button, real button or soft button on a smartphone, and I indicate by this when I'm talking to the machine. Or the machine or the computer is waiting for a stretch of silence of some hundreds of milliseconds and then starts processing my input, trying to interpret this, then producing the system response. And this is rather small and more like a walkie-talkie style, not like a natural way to interact with each other by voice as we are used to that. And therefore, current research is going in the direction of enabling systems to also act like a human by providing proper turn-taking signals. For this, we need a new architecture. We need a so-called incremental architecture because the system has constantly to listen to the user, trying to interpret what the intention of my speech is and prepare proper reactions. In order to be ready when the transition relevant point comes and the turn-taking takes place. Quite related to turn-taking, in a matter that it's multimodal, is emotion. Otherwise, it's not that related. Emotions are signaled, of course, by posture, but mostly the most research that we have done is concerning facial expressions and voice. With emotions, we can assume that they are so-called basic or pure emotions. This is of course debated, but we can consider that there are some emotions or categories of emotions which are so strong and widespread that they are culturally independent and universal, like fear for life or pure hatred or strong joy. So one of the pioneers for this was actually Charles Darwin. We know from facial expressions that it's quite easy to determine and interpret which kind of emotion has which facial expression. You see here the so-called 6 basic emotions, at least provided by some researchers. The actual number is not that certain. But from left to right, the 6 emotions are joy, sadness, anger, surprise, disgust, and the last one is fear. These seems to be quite obvious, but we have similar expressions in voice. Here's a small list provided by Scherer, which kind of so-called prosodic or voice-related parameters and features there are to express or to perceive basic emotions in voice. I also have some audio examples of German actors trying to act such an emotion. I will only play back a few of them. So joy, for example, is quite distinctive because joy usually comes together with the spreading of the lips. And this actually affects the frequency energy distribution. So you may remember from an earlier video the so-called formants, the resonance frequencies in the mouth. And these are affected by the spreading of the lips. But also joy is typically exhibited by or signaled by a high pitch and a rather strong melody, so raising up and down movements of pitch. Another example is anger. Anger, for example, has really strong stressed syllables and also a falling intonation contour. Here's the example of a German actor.
Das schwarze Blatt Papier befindet sich da oben neben dem Holzstück.
And as you have noticed, it is also quite loud. Fear, on the other hand, typically has a soft intensity, a soft voice. That means it's not that loud. However, it has a high pitch and a usually higher tempo. Disgust, on the other hand, has a slow tempo and long stressed syllables and less pitch variation. And here's an example.
Das schwarze Blatt Papier befindet sich da oben neben dem Holzstück.
Maybe you have noticed there's another issue. She sounds like having a really closure in the throat, just like as she would have liked to prevent to eat something that is really not tasty. But this is just one prototypical way to signal disgust. There are other ways. Sadness has less pitch variation. It's very monotonic and also very slight pitch accents, so are not as stressed as with anger, for example. It often comes together with a slow tempo and long pauses. Here's an example.
Das schwarze Blatt Papier befindet sich da oben neben dem Holzstück.
Maybe you have heard that this particular actor, this particular way of signaling sadness also results in a fading of voicing in the end. That means as if she is physically not able to have the strength to properly pronounce and articulate. The last example is boredom. And this is actually just one of the basic emotions that we defined. So this is typically not in the set of the 6 basic emotions. It is rather similar to sadness in a way that it is slow and low in pitch. But here you find a certain difference in, for example, physical strength that is signaled.
Das schwarze Blatt Papier befindet sich da oben neben dem Holzstück.
In contrast to sadness, she starts really high in pitch and she has a certain way of a rhythmic pattern. And this is quite typical, this rhythmic pattern of showing that is apparently something that comes again and again is therefore really boring. I have on the slides a link to the right where you have a nice example, a nice collection of modern and older text-to-speech synthesis voices which are able to produce emotions or affective states. Check it out if you are interested in that. The most important thing about emotions, not only that it is multimodally signaled by, for example, facial expressions and voice, but also that despite being universal, there are cultural differences. At least when we're able to speak, we have some control about our body. And this means the cultural preferences of showing or not showing emotions takes place here. Now I'll show you a small example how in a virtual person emotions are synthesized. This is again, I think, about 10 years old, but it shows nicely the different modalities that can be used for producing and synthesizing emotions.
Did Safin and Fur have any difficulties?
They were already trailing.
We have seen nice recovery. Let's see the next game.
Definitely.
Roddick has been unbeatable recently.
No doubt, he is a genius.
Sapin generates a gorgeous cross-court backhand winner right in the middle.
It was almost impossible to get that return back.
Furr had a hard time recently.
But that is what bad players usually have.
Roddick has been 4 times injured since last year.
It's amazing how he got back. None of the players are playing on favorite surface.
It should harm performance of Sapin and Furr.
What an unexpected lob.
It's a bad idea to try to return a lob at the net. Forehand by Blake drifts outside the left sideline.
Blake just overcooked his forehand.
And, finally, water relief.
Oh no.
The sister of look, Blake missed the huge backhand return by Furr. The score is already 30-40.
No, Blake and Roddick are facing a break
To
point.
answer the question, Sapin and Furr are leading. The sister of Sapin is also playing tennis.